Okay. Thank you for the privilege of being able to share with you all as a teacher, not a preacher. All right. My wife and I have been at Hannibal LaGrange College up here in Missouri for 22 years now and have enjoyed every semester of it, all 44 of them, although I still have a stack of papers to deal with this one, so it's not quite done. And so I'll teach this as though I was teaching students on a topic that is interesting to me and I hope will be interesting to you. It's one I wouldn't have picked for myself, all right? But I got this email and I have this persistent friend, Dick Todd, who asked me to consider sharing a few thoughts out of the Old Testament, since the topic for this year is a topic that really has its roots right out of the Torah, out of the Law of Moses. And so when I heard that you all were interested in having something on Mosaic Atonement, I said, well, if that's what you're interested in, maybe I can share a few thoughts, and I hope that they'll be ones that are useful to you and your ministry. If we can't make these things useful to our ministry, I'm not sure why we really need to be doing it. But we'll see what we can come up with. And as a teacher, I've got an outline, but as an incompetent electronics guy, you'll never see it, okay? So it won't be up there. Y'all probably have your outlines and pictures and nice things on Sunday mornings like that. You don't? Wow. Okay. Well, you try to surround yourself by competent people. That's what I try to do. I've got a couple subpoints just to let you know where we're headed with this. First of all, we'll talk about the vocabulary of atonement. Being a Hebrew-type guy, I'm not a Jew, but being a guy who loves Hebrew and enjoys working with the original languages, especially the Hebrew. Being left-handed, I probably partially dyslexic anyway, so I feel right at home with stuff like that. And so we'll look at the Hebrew vocabulary associated with atonement, and then we'll try to make it interesting if we can, which is the amazing part about it. And then we'll try to get into how these words are used in the Old Testament. We'll look at the atonement in Torah ritual. How's that for a good technical thing? The atonement in Torah ritual. And then we'll move over to the atonement in Torah narratives. And then we'll look for, if we have time, Mosaic atonement as reflected in the larger Old Testament. Now, as a teacher, and since I'm not a preacher type, if you have a question at some point and you want to raise it, go ahead, okay? And if I see you, we'll stop and talk about it. And if I don't know the answer, then I'll fake it and we'll just go on, okay? So that's what I always do. Works for me, okay? But we'll start with the vocabulary of the atonement. And how many of you have ever had Hebrew before? Anybody have Hebrew? Don't you love that language? I paid for a good part of my seminary education by dealing with desperate students who were failing either Hebrew or Greek. And I did a lot of tutoring at Southwestern Seminary in the mid-'70s and early '80s down in Fort Worth. And a typical response from especially the Hebrew students was, Lord, if you just get me through this class, I promise I'll never touch it again. And they did. They didn't, whatever. Okay, they did get through and they didn't touch it again. But I do. And there is one particular term in the Old Testament that is the term that deals with atonement. The problem is we're not exactly sure what it means. There's a lot of discussion about what this term kafar, KPR, or whatever, means. And so you have many different translations and lots of discussions about particularly what this term that we usually traditionally translate as to atone does mean. The primary theory that controlled biblical interpretation, really since the days of the Septuagint, which would be pre-Christian days, the LXX, the Septuagint, would deal with it in a way that did not fit real well with the European mind. They didn't have a perfect term for dealing with this particular word, okay? And so they just tried to rely upon the Hebraisms, what they understood of Hebrew culture, and tried to deal with it as best they could. But what is implicit in this verb is something that does not connect with a lot of cultures in the world. What does it mean to kafar something? Well, let's start with the Canaanite background, because in the days of Moses, there were lots of Canaanites in the Promised Land, and that was the dominant culture of the day. And while the people in that particular culture in Canaan did understand animal sacrifice, did understand the idea of making gifts to God, they probably had, our best understanding is they had a very different reason for making sacrifices to God. We do find in the Old Testament that this term kafar is very regularly associated with the sacrificial system. But if you were a Canaanite and you heard this stuff going on, you probably wouldn't have known exactly what was meant, even as the Septuagintal translators might not have known what it meant. The people of the Canaanite region did offer sacrifices, but they did it with a completely different worldview. Their belief was that there were many different gods. There was a god of the wind that could bring heat or cool air, whatever, and could bring even locusts that would come in and hurt you. There were gods of plagues. There were gods of water. There were gods of war. And you needed to keep all of these gods happy, because you wouldn't want what those winds could blow in, or you wouldn't want the diseases that plague god Resheph could bring in. You wouldn't want the bad things that could happen from the god of the hills, or the gods of the valleys, or the gods of the water bodies around you, if they were mad at you and wanted to trouble you. And so, and what's worse, none of those gods were very nice. They didn't particularly like people. They didn't want to be bothered by people. They didn't want to be disturbed, and people were kind of a nuisance to them. And so you've got all these powerful beings that control things that can make or break your economic success or your health and wealth and prosperity, and yet they don't like you. So what can you do to get along with them? And the answer is bribe them. And so the sacrificial system of the Old Testament, as practiced by the Canaanites, and frankly by many Israelites, was a bribery system. You give the god a portion of what you have in order to keep them off your back, or more positively, to make them do something nice for you. The old do ut des, to use a Latin phrase, I'll give you something, now you give me something idea, was very much at play in the sacrificial system. What was not at play is what is implicit in this verb kafar, best we understand it. It seems that the way that the Israelites viewed religion was strange to the local inhabitants of not just Canaan, but that entire region, Egyptians included. They believed, first of all, in just one God. The same God who controlled the wind also controlled disease, also had powers on the hilltops and in the valleys, over the waters and the dry land. And this is a very powerful and important God. This God is also our maker and oversees every detail of our lives. That concept of sovereignty is very much a part of the Old Testament. And so this God has imposed behavioral expectations upon us. He's set standards for us to meet. And if we fail to meet those standards, He's upset, okay? He's offended, and we've got to do something about it. Now, do you bribe a God like that to overlook these problems? What do you do in a case like that? Well, you kafar him. But here again, we're not exactly sure what that means. And so various translational efforts have been made. And attempts to try to trace this back in sister languages of Hebrew, in Arabic and other Semitic languages have been made. Attempts like this have been made over the years. A traditional translation of this verb, a traditional etymology of it, would be to take it back to the concept of to cover, okay, kafar, to cover. There's an Arabic word, kafara, that means something to that effect. The problem is, if you trace back the etymology of kafara, the Arabic word, it seems to go back to the Hebrew. It's like they borrowed it from the Hebrew, and so that's not really a good thing to do, but it does mean to cover. And if you were to look in the book of Genesis, you can see some evidence that maybe this concept of kafaring refers to cover. Because way back in God's directions to Noah, recorded by Moses, we do have a situation where God says, Noah, there's this bad weather coming, and I want you to get ready for it. And I want you to build a boat. And I want you to kafar. I want you to cover the wood with a substance that will protect it. And this concept of placing a protective cover over something. In the case of Noah's boat, it was pitch, but covering it over was understood for many centuries in Christianity as being exactly what is meant by atonement. Atonement is placing a cover over something. Okay? Now, to reinforce this concept of covering, and exactly what you're covering and what you're covering it with is maybe a matter of debate, but reinforcing this concept of covering is the Hebrew vocabulary term for what is traditionally translated as the mercy seat. You may recall that there were several different pieces of sacred furniture that Moses was authorized to construct in the worship of God in the Torah. And of all the pieces of furniture that were to be used in the worship site, none was more holy than the Aron Elohim, the Ark of God. Okay? And on top of the ark, that special golden box, 45 inches long, 27 inches wide, size of maybe a coffee table or something like that, a small coffee table, not a particularly large piece of furniture. On top of that special gold-plated box was a very special topper of some sort, made of solid gold. Its name, kaporet, KPR. Those three letters are at the heart of that particular word as well. What is this special golden cover to this Ark of the Covenant? It's been translated as the mercy seat, certainly, as a covering to the ark. Various translations have been attempted, and nobody really knows what to do with that word as well. But it is, again, a covering to the ark. And so you have Noah then kafaring his boat to keep the water out and to keep people alive on the inside. You have this KPR-type golden cover to the Ark of the Covenant. And so maybe this word does mean cover. Or maybe it doesn't. Okay. As people got into the study of the Old Testament, they wanted to learn more about Old Testament culture, and so we started sending over, as Europeans are wont to do, scientists, or maybe just treasure hunters, that in the 1800s went over to Iraq and Syria and Palestine and started digging up every mound that they could to try to find proofs to the Bible, to try to find biblical cities and evidences of biblical culture. And among other things that they came up with as they were beginning to investigate these different sites over there were little pieces of clay, just big enough to fit in the palm of your hand, most of them, cuneiform tablets. And they found sometimes that there would be larger slabs of these, pieces of old dried clay, many of which had been baked, that had had little marks mashed into them. And they knew that these were language things, but it sure wasn't Hebrew. It was a language they'd never seen before, and with a great deal of effort, they were able to translate, to break the code in these cuneiform tablets, and to translate these, and therefore to open up a great deal of information about life as it existed in ancient Iraq, Syria, and other parts of the Near East. And as they translated these tablets, they came across KPR-type words occasionally. And so the hope was that as they found words that had this, what appeared to be a related word to the Hebrew, they could finally get at what the meaning of kafar is. And as a result, it certainly expanded our knowledge of what this core might mean. But when these translations were published and people studied them, it seems that what kafar meant, or kaparu in the Akkadian Babylonian language, what kaparu meant was something more like to wipe. For example, there's a ritual in one of these tablets. You got a sick person or a person who's got some sort of a problem. You take a piece of bread and you kapar them with it. You wipe them, apparently, with this thing. And so another suggested possibility is then that maybe it's the concept of wiping, as in some sort of a ritual that would maybe wipe away or purge sin or something to that effect. Now we've got the concept of cover, and then a second alternative based upon archaeological study and translation of tablets that have been discovered, the concept of to wipe or to purge, something to that effect. But then, as you go back to the Bible and you try to plug in those meanings to cover or to wipe, there are there's a particular noun that's used a few times in the Bible that's a KPR type noun. It's not a verb, it is a noun. And, for example, when the Israelites in Exodus chapter 30 are supposed to pay a half shekel tax, 2/10 of an ounce of silver, every man was to give 2/10 of an ounce of silver, when censuses were taken. This was to be given as a kofar, okay, the Hebrew term, KPR. To be given as a ransom. To be given as a ransom is the way that the Septuagint translated it, and versions have followed that. So maybe KPR is not so much the concept of covering things over or wiping things out, purging them, but maybe it's the concept of a ransom. If you've checked out in historical theology different theories of atonement, you hear kind of the roots of some of these different theories of atonement, ransom theory, maybe some of these others, that would be in all of this. And so there are three primary possible translations that are given to this verb in modern Hebrew study. Okay, one, again, to cover. Two, to wipe out or to purge. Three, to ransom. And all of them make sense in different contexts, and enough so that some people have suggested that, well, there was more than one KPR verb in Hebrew, and they just happened to come together, and and they have very different meanings, and even though they're pronounced the same, they're homophonic, they have the same sound, they really are from different backgrounds completely. So it's an unresolved issue, really, when it comes to the vocabulary of atonement in the Torah. Or in the Old Testament in general. But we can all agree that it does refer to a term that probably doesn't fit well with Canaanite theology. It's not the kind of thing that Europeans would do in their religion. The Septuagint writers weren't exactly sure how to use it. They had to borrow one of their terms and try to make it fit. Expiate or purge or propitiate, something like that, it would be the meaning of ex alaskami. But as we think about this term, maybe we can come up with our own definition based upon how it's used and as we look at it in the texts of the Torah itself. And so we move to part 2, atonement in Torah ritual. Now, the primary texts, you could argue, in which these things occur are found in the book of Leviticus. The majority of the terms, more than 50 of the instances in which KPR is used in the Torah, the majority of times it is found in the book of Leviticus. And so many of our texts, though not all of them, will come from that passage, from that particular book. But as we look at these instances, a lot of these things are inseparably linked to sacrifice. Now, the sacrificial system of the Hebrews is discussed in great detail in the book of Leviticus, also mentioned in Numbers and occasionally in Deuteronomy, particular aspects of the ritual. We have different kinds of sacrifices, and all of these are connected in some way with kafar, with atonement. The first of these in the book of Leviticus is the so-called burnt offering, or the olah. Now, historically, the olah, the Hebrew term, or the burnt offering as we would typically translate it, the Hebrew vocabulary term for that is that which goes up. An olah is that which goes up in smoke, I guess. Translated as a Holocaust offering, actually, in the Septuagint, that which is completely burned. Okay, and this is associated, according to some of the texts, with atonement. And I guess I could open up the book of Leviticus here, see if we can look at maybe a reference to this kind of thing. Okay, for example, in Leviticus chapter 1, they talk about the burnt offering or the Holocaust offering, the one that's completely burned up, the most expensive of the offerings, I might say. Because when you offer up a burnt offering, first of all, you've got to provide enough wood to burn up a lot of muscle tissue, a lot of organ meat. And that's an expensive undertaking. Not only that, nobody gets to eat anything from the animal, and so it's all consumed. Nobody benefits from it, not even the priest, who's got to work hard to burn the animal up. It's an expensive kind of offering. But in chapter 1, verse 4, there is the note that he, that is the one offering, is to lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering so it can be accepted on his behalf to make atonement, to kapar for him, lachaper, okay, to make atonement or whatever. The burnt offering is associated with atonement. Burnt offering, a very expensive kind of offering, but nowhere in the Old Testament is there a statement made as to the purpose of a burnt offering if it's not for kafaring God. So biblical scholars have speculated, why in the world would people in the Hebrew religion, in the Israelite religion, burn an animal completely up? And the reason we think they did this was consecration. They're trying to prove that they are using that animal as a substitute for themselves. Okay? And in fact, it says, for example, and we just read this in verse 4 of Leviticus 1, the offer is to lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering so that it can be accepted on his behalf. And so by placing your hands on the head of the animal, you're identifying specifically with that animal, and you're basically transferring something of your identity to that one, so that when that one is killed, then you're being killed, okay? Except that you're a living sacrifice. That animal dies, but you live on. And yet that animal, through his death, has now atoned, has kafared for you, whatever that means, okay? So you do have then that as the first of the three kind of blood sacrifices that were made in the Old Testament. A second kind, besides the burnt offering, is the sin offering, the chatat, as it's called in the Hebrew. And we can read about those in particular in Leviticus chapter 4, and really quite a few places throughout the Old Testament. This is oftentimes, according to scholars, associated most closely with atonement. There are burnt offerings. We'll see later on there are guilt offerings or a sham offering, whatever you want to call it, however you want to translate that. But the one that is given the greatest play in the text is the sin offering and the chatat. What's the purpose of a sin offering? There are a lot of similarities to the burnt offering, but ritually there are some distinctions. First of all, the kind of animals that are used would differ a little bit. We'll not get into that. I don't think it's relevant to our topic today. The ritual is similar. Again, you have to place your hand on the head of the animal. The primary aspect of it, though, is that somebody gets to eat the muscles. Somebody gets to eat the meat of it, and that would be the priest. God is always to be given part of that animal. For example, in the Hebrew tradition, in Asia, animals were believed to have sacred organs within themselves. The Babylonians, for example, would have what amounted to magic sheep. They'd have temple lands, temple fields that they would raise a special breed of sheep on, and these sheep raised on sacred ground, raised by sacred shepherds, would have great power to discern the future And in fact, the gods would use these magic animals to help you know the will of the gods. And so if you ever, as a Babylonian king or official, needed to find out some important information, you take one of those sacred animals and you would butcher it, or the priest would, and they would reach inside of the animal and take out the most sacred organ of that animal. On the basis of the shape of that sacred organ, they would know the future, because this sacred animal with that most sacred organ inside itself would be the instrument of revelation. But what was considered to be the most sacred organ within animals, within all that region of the world in that day? It's a very different kind of thought than what we have today. The answer? The liver. Okay. The liver was considered in Asian cultures to be the really special part, the most special part of an animal. It was used to discern the divine will in ancient Iraq. In Israelite worship as well, you wanted to give God that which was the most sacred part of the animal back to Him, the most special part. And so, always within Israelite ritual, a portion of the liver would be given to God. You'd give the kidneys, you'd give the fat as well, and there was probably a great deal of symbolic significance to all of these things. But the rest of the meat would be given to the priest to feed his family, since the Lord was the portion for the Levites in the Old Testament. But what's the purpose? Is there a fundamentally different purpose for a person offering a chatat, a sin offering, as opposed to a burnt offering? Why would you make one for one purpose and another for another? Why would you give them a separate name? Well, the best we can come up with, especially based upon the name chatat, since that is based upon a Hebrew word which does mean sin, is that you offer up a sin offering because you done it. You sinned. You did something you weren't supposed to do. And so you've angered God. You broke a rule. You have done something that has offended the deity. He gave you a set of guidelines to live by, and either you did something that you weren't supposed to do, or you didn't do something you were supposed to do. One of the two. But one way or the other, you blew it. Okay? You have missed the mark, to use the core concept of chata. And in so doing, you've got something that needs to be fixed. And the way you fix it, the way that you make atonement, the way that you kafar for yourself, is you give a chatat, an I missed the mark kind of offering, a sin offering. And so we regularly associate the concept of the sin offering with that term expiation. You've got a God who's been offended, and now you've got to make him not feel so bad towards you. And so you place your hands on this animal, and then that animal's throat is slit, the blood is drained out into a basin. The animal is butchered otherwise, certain sacred organs are burned to God. The priest takes the rest of it, but you as the one who's committed the offense get no benefit from it, okay? Except that you're now atoned for. You're now kafared, okay? Now, is that covering over your sin so that your sin is still there, but it's just kind of painted over? Is that what we mean by kafar? Do we mean that it's been wiped away through this? Or do we mean that maybe you've been ransomed and that this animal has now paid a ransom for you? I think you could build arguments in any one of those three directions should you want to. And therefore, the discussion will probably go on for several generations beyond our own as to exactly what is meant by this. But it's very clear that the Bible says, the Torah says, that someone who has offered up that kind of a sacrifice has now been kafared, okay? And it's apparently because of something that they did that they should not have done or did not do but should have done. And so, that's the sin offering. Now, there's a third kind of offering in these opening chapters of Leviticus. We do have the burnt offering. We do have the sin offering. Well, actually, there are more. But in terms of blood sacrifices, we have what the Holman Christian Standard Bible has struggled to rename the restitution offering, or the guilt offering, as it's said in various translations. And we're looking Leviticus 5, I guess, would have something to do with that, part of it. Yeah, beginning in 5:14, for example. You can also look in chapter 7, even parts of chapter 6. But nonetheless, the asham. Now, what is the purpose of an asham? Well, this is actually considered to be a subcategory of the sin offering. It's sin part B. It's a sin offering type B, or something to that effect. It also is used when somebody has done something they should not have done, or didn't do something they should have done, but especially when they did something they shouldn't have done. One scholar suggests that it refers to things that you've done wrong for which reparation is possible. Okay, you stole something from somebody, and you're caught. Well, you owe somebody 4 sheep for that sheep you stole. Okay, you can pay them back, and you will, or else the courts will get you. But you also owe God something, because you broke His law, and you owe Him a special kind of sin offering, the asham, the guilt offering, or as we say in the Holman Christian Standard Bible, the restitution offering. You can provide restitution for what you have done. Okay, and this also, though, is done lachaper, to kafar, for what you have done. Okay, so closely is the sacrificial system associated with this concept of covering or atonement, or whatever you want to call it, that you cannot distinguish fully the functions of any of these blood sacrifices from atonement or from kafar, whatever it means. And since it's always associated most directly with blood sacrifices, then the question is, can you separate atonement from blood? And while you could find some instances where blood sacrifices were not necessarily a part of rebuilding a broken relationship, nonetheless, it is very clear that the closest links in the Bible are between atonement and blood. So much so that you can say that atonement does not occur except with the shedding of blood. So now scholars looking for ways to keep off the streets come up with other discussions and things to write about and argue about. One of which is, therefore, is the blood, is it the life of a being, or is it the death of a being that causes atonement to occur? If blood is the life of something, then is it the life that gives atonement, or is it the death that gives atonement? And we're splitting hairs probably at this point, because the life is in the blood, so the Torah says, and it is. Leviticus 17 speaks of that. The life is in the blood, but the lack of blood, the pouring out, the shedding of the blood, means that death is very much a part of blood as well. Lack of blood equals death. And in these sacrifices, what are you doing but you're emptying these living beings of their blood, and therefore death is the ultimate motif associated with atonement. So you're going to have some people who say atonement is about life because blood is life. But I think on the whole, the fact that you're depriving these animals of their blood and you're pouring it out before God means that that death and atonement are most closely linked. Atonement, kafar, means death. Whether it's a transferred kind of death, you're laying your hands on this animal, or whether it is your own death, whoa, okay, then atonement seems to mean death in some way, okay? Okay, so that's one of the kinds of rituals, sacrifice, definitely at the heart of atonement. Question over here.
I wanted to ask you, Numbers 16.
Numbers 16. Oh, the book of Numbers. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, with Korah.
This is not a math type thing. We're not talking the numbers. Numbers chapter 16. Yes, sir.
After this situation with Korah and this rebellion that occurred, Moses, after the people got upset and blamed Moses and Aaron for this thing happening, and God was beginning to bring a plague around, Moses told Aaron to go out and take the censer and take some of the coals from the altar, put in that, and wave that thing to make atonement for the people. Or at least that's the way it's worded in the ESV. Help me to understand that.
Well, you're looking at part 3 in the outline. You're talking about atonement in Torah narratives. And you're looking at a genuine passage that deals with atonement, and an important one. And one that, in this case, didn't deal with an olah, a chatat, or an asham, a burnt offering, a sin offering, or a guilt offering. But I think we could agree it dealt with death, nonetheless. Notice, for example, in chapter 16 of the book of Numbers, verse 40, you mentioned the fact that a plague had broken out in Korah's rebellion, and truly it did. God was mad. He was hacked, okay? And those who died from the plague, according to verse 49 in this chapter, those who died from the plague numbered 14,700, in addition to those who died because of the Korah incident, HCSB says right here. And so there was death. Now, in this case, it might have been the shedding of blood of those who were guilty in particular. But notice that there still was death, okay, involved in this. So, but the role of the priest, and we're going to talk at some point about the role of the priest in the atonement thing, was clearly played by Aaron. And Aaron's role in this deadly circumstance was the burning of incense. It was the making of a non-blood sacrifice, if you please, burning incense, which was a combination of ground saps and bug parts, okay, all mixed together in some smelly concoction, and smoky as well. But we still have the role of a priest, and we still have death, and we have something, a role being played by the priest to assuage, to take away the anger of God in this case, after much damage had been done and after a price had been paid in it all. Yeah, that's a fascinating sort of thing, and it is clearly going to have, it's kind of the outlier in our nexus here. It's the one that we'd like to just throw out as a statistical oddity, but in fact, it's in the Torah, and it does show us that the concept of kafaring involves more than just blood, okay? More than just animal blood. And we need to take that that particular narrative very seriously. Thank you. Good. Any other questions, by the way? Dave, yes.
On these 3 blood sacrifices, the burnt offering, just from what you shared, it seems like only the extremely rich would be able to offer this kind of offering. I mean, we see that in the Old Testament. I mean, how does a common person of that day, just quite literally, barely subsisting, offer a valuable animal like an ox or a bull as a total perfect sacrifice?
Okay, so you're, just so for the record, because maybe not everybody can hear and maybe the tape can't hear either, you're asking, could everybody afford to give a blood sacrifice for their sin? That seems like a pretty hefty price to pay, especially if it was a bull, you said, or something like that. Yeah. Well, the good news is, first of all, common folks didn't have to burn bulls, okay? That was for a higher order of sin, okay? Or a person higher up on the pyramid of society, closer to the top of that power grid, whatever, that power pyramid there. But now, clearly, in the book of Leviticus, the assumption was that not everyone could afford an animal sacrifice, in which case that is a big animal, like a nice mammalian type thing, a goat or a sheep, or in some cases even a cow, okay, depending on the nature, but especially the goat and sheep for common folks, okay? Well, that's fine. If you can't afford that, how about a couple of birds? Go kill a bird, okay? And so birds were acceptable. And these you didn't have to raise yourself. You could theoretically go out and catch one, okay? And perhaps you could then have that, but that blood would still be shed as for a sin offering, okay? The shedding of blood principle could be extended then to the poor who could find a bird that could substitute for them, or maybe a couple of birds, okay? But let's suppose that you've got somebody who's more incompetent than Barney was in the Andy Griffith Show one when they went hiking and tried to catch a bird and he couldn't do it, okay? And so now he can't afford a mammal, he can't catch a bird. What's he supposed to do? Well, in a case like that, the Torah says, well, you still need to pay a price. And so why don't you deprive yourself of a couple of meals? Give me some of your food. Give me some grain. Still, the concept is sacrifice, and by giving up food which you need for the sustenance of life, you're in essence giving up part of your life, and therefore are paying the life sacrifice, though blood is not literally involved. But still, the concept of giving up a part of your life through a food offering, that depriving yourself of, especially as a very poor person, much needed grain. Okay? So the principle of giving up a part of life for your sin seems to be at work right here. And if we're kind of entering into the zone of death in a substitute sort of way, even if it's with grain. But clearly the principle was extended as far as could be to ensure the shedding of blood. A provision being made, notwithstanding, for some alternative in the worst case scenarios. Okay. Good question. Good question. Over here.
Just thought of this because you talked about pigeons and cows and a little bit. Why, and this might seem like a silly question, but why is Christ referred to as the Lamb of God and not the goat or cow? Because there were different sacrifices, not just lamb, all those different things.
Yeah, the same Hebrew term, which can mean goat, can also mean sheep, first of all. The term meant small animal, herded and used for consumptive purposes, whatever, or to provide protein, basically, for the diet of the Hebrews, whether it be through the meat or through the milk, the cheeses, whatever that could be produced by it. So, first of all, the Hebrew term can be translated as either goat or sheep. Second, probably within the 1st century A.D., during the time of Peter, for example, Paul, when Jesus was referred to as the sacrificial lamb, that probably was the primary offering used at the temple. That's my best guess. As a guy who sees the New Testament as the footnote to the Old Testament, that's the way that's the way I see it. Okay. Explanatory footnote. It's an important one. You need it. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Well, maybe more. Oh, another one.
Well, I just wondered if, like in Genesis 3:16, you maybe covered this in the question. So Genesis 3:21, the Lord made for Adam his wife garments of skin and clothed them. Are we to see that as a ramification of atonement, or that's pre-sacrificial, pre-law that this God? So does that fit into the mix symbol?
Okay, so Genesis 3:21, the mention of God supplying the sinners, Adam and Eve now, with a covering for themselves, would fit into the thousand-year-old interpretive tradition of connecting kafar with covering and implicitly death. How did God choose to supply those animal skins? Well, probably, although it's not mentioned in the biblical text, he killed something. Okay? And so we do seem to have a possible root, a rhizome or something, leading toward the plant, that the full-blown, observable aspect of atonement and ultimately the atoning death of Christ. Yeah, I think that's one of those things that lines up with the bigger picture, but leaves a lot unstated, okay? But clearly you do have implicitly death and covering, okay? And supplied by God, by the way, not by a human being. All those point very nicely toward what we understand to be the work of Christ.
So, just to be more practical, if I was preaching on that, I would want to use that as a springboard to look at how that, maybe the deeper meaning is seen in the sacrificial system, or...
Yeah, I would say that...
I want to trumpet that as the, proof of the atonement even before the Lord.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's best to preach important doctrines from the explicit passages that make it clearest. As a discourse linguist, one of the things I think that I love to do, and I love to specialize in narrative and find unity, is to see in a well-told, unified story, you're going to have hints from the very beginning of a well-told story that point toward the most important moment in a story. Okay? You've got all these things that are there to point toward the key moment. Andy Griffith show, okay. I'm an addict of Andy Griffith, 157 black and white episodes especially. And in one of them, you have Opie doing something that he's never done before. He's got a magic kit, and he's the science book type thing with all these magic things. And he's never played with a magic science book before, science and magic. But there he is at the very beginning of the show, goofing around with this stuff and showing his dad how an egg could be popped into a gallon glass jug. All right? Now, you might say, boy, they were sure light on material this week to have Opie sticking an egg in a jug. Okay, no, they're not. That's very important because from that same book will later come about a formula for disappearing ink that will be needed so that Opie doesn't have to marry into the Darwin family. Okay, and we don't want Opie stuck in an unhappy situation for the rest of his life, and so we had to have that at the front. Okay. And so you have these little oddities that you say, how does that fit? But if you see the big picture, then you know how it fits. And it's really preparing you for the peak moment. Genesis 3:21 is one of those kinds of things that makes best sense if you see the Bible as a unified book and Jesus as the peak moment in the book. And you say, now I see why it was there. Okay. But just to look at it, there's no blood. There's no theological doctrines that are stated in an explicit way. There's just that little thing that needs to be seen from the mountaintop down. And once you see it there, it does make a lot of sense. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Don't mess up my analogy. Do you hear? Okay. How dare you? Okay. Yeah. And in that little footnote, you can mark Jesus as the key moment because one of the ways that you mark key moments in a text is you repeat material. And we criticize people in written literature for being repetitive. But the fact is, in oral literature, when you're creating a peak, one of the ways that you do it is you repeat material. And if you look in the Bible, you have a very unusual character, one who's 100% God and 100% man, the only one like him in the whole story from Genesis to Revelation. And you've got this God-man story told not once, not twice, not even 3 times, but 4 times. Okay, so you've got excessive repetition of material. You've got a very unusual character. You have lots of spoken words from this character. That's another way of enhancing the thematicity of an individual. You have all these things that point to Jesus, and yeah, it is in the footnote. But it's an important footnote. Did I not say it was an important footnote? It's an important footnote. Okay. Yes. Pat.
The Israelites perceived in that peak moment, the peak moment in their sacrifice?
Well, clearly, Jesus' life makes a whole lot more sense if we take the Torah seriously, and if we were to preach the Torah more and try to preach it from the inside as though we were Jewish, and I don't mean leave Christ out or leave the hope of the New Testament out, but understand why these things were necessary and help our congregations understand the importance of what these things were doing within their cultural context thousands of years ago, then we kind of reach this aha moment when Jesus comes along. And we'll say, wow, now that is atonement right there. It's got all the elements, okay? It's got this one whom we laid our hands on, who is now taking our place for us. We've got one who sheds his blood for us. We've got one who also satisfies this offended God. And so we have so many things that will make more sense if we have a good grounding in even such boring things as the book of Leviticus. Okay? Jesus just fits a lot better into the picture if we have those initial things. Genesis 3:21 also. All of those. Okay? So in other words, let's see, three quarters of God's Word is which testament again? So how much percent of Bible preaching should be? Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. Now, other things in the Torah rituals that were associated with kafar: consecration or purification. You look at the Holman Christian Standard Bible, and I didn't design this. They have these little black dots that interrupt your reading. And one of the black dots is associated with atonement. And you look at the black dot and you wonder, why is it there? And so you check in the back and there's a dictionary. And it says atonement is purification. Okay? So the HCSB editors said that atonement is purification. And in fact, we do see that there's a lot in the Hebrew text, in the laws, that seems to be satisfied if we associate kafar with purifying. For example, in Leviticus 8, God's putting together the first team of religious leaders, putting his staff together, okay? And Aaron and Aaron's sons are selected out of all the Israelites. These are the ones that are going to be in charge of the worship. But to prepare them for the worship, they need to be kafared. They need to be made ready in some way for service to God. And there are blood sacrifices that are necessarily carried out before Aaron is ever permitted to function as a priest. And once those blood rituals have been carried out, and he's had blood placed on certain parts of his pieces of his hands, for example, okay, his ears and various parts. Anyway, you've got these things. Once the blood is there, then he is now fit for service. Has he been covered? Has he been ransomed? Has he been wiped? What's been done with him? Or has he been purified and made ready for service? Well, you can throw purification into the mix as another possible meaning of this word right here as well. Priests needed to be purified before they could ever do their work. Okay, the people on the Day of Atonement would need to be purified so that they could be acceptable before God, or they need to be kafared anyway, whatever that means. Levites, likewise, before they could do service in the sacred temple or tabernacle area, also had to undergo kafar. And the various objects associated with the worship, likewise, had to undergo I won't say a bloodbath, but they did have to have blood sprinkled on them. There had to be a shedding of blood in order to make this stuff work. The altar for animal sacrifices, before it could ever be used, had to have raw blood poured upon it. Okay? The incense altar had to be kafared. The mercy seat, the kaporet, that golden plate, that golden cover for the Ark of the Covenant, blood on it. The most holy place, blood placed within it. Tent of meeting as a whole, same thing. All of these from Leviticus, in particular Leviticus 16. Okay? Kafar in Hebrew ritual also was necessary, again, as we'd mentioned, Exodus chapter 30 and the taking of the census. The kofar had to be made. Exodus chapter 30, verse 15. Just to make sure we have a reading of this. Exodus 30, 15. The wealthy may not give more than that 0.2 of an ounce of silver, half a shekel. The poor may not give less than half a shekel when giving the contribution to the Lord to atone for your lives. To atone for your lives. Okay? So it was, you had to give money as an atonement in this case. But you could argue again that money is basically, as one giving video that we watched in our church when we had a building program said, what is money but minted personality? It's life. Your money represents life, once again. And so you're giving a portion of your life in that sense for the preservation of your life so that you won't be killed following a census, because God would, in fact, plague the nation if they did not atone for the taking of a census. Now, there are also a whole series of laws in Leviticus, final category of ritual type things that employ kafar. Okay. Restoration following various conditions. Okay. In order to be restored to a rightful place within the community after various situations had arisen in your life, in order to experience that restoration, you had to be kafared. You had to undergo this atonement kind of thing. For example, after a woman had given birth to a child, Leviticus chapter 12, moving to the book of Leviticus, chapter 12, beginning in verse 7, we have a situation where a woman, after she has given birth to a child, to a male in this particular instance, has had the child properly circumcised. She undergoes a series of 33 days of impurity. Okay. At the end of it all, chapter 12, verse 7, the priest is to help her re-enter society. And so the priest will present before the Lord, some things before the Lord, including, if the woman is poor, a young pigeon or a turtle dove, okay, a sin offering, a chatat. The priest will present these before the Lord and make atonement on her behalf. She will be clean from her discharge of blood, and birthing can be a pretty bloody process. This is the law for a woman giving birth, whether to a male or female. Okay? And so then we do have this concept of a woman apparently being restored to a rightful place within the community following an issue of blood in her life. Okay? In this case, a birthing event of a male or female. When scholars look at this, and well, let's look at a couple others. Leviticus chapter 14, a couple chapters over. Leviticus chapter 14, verse 19. Now we're talking about matzora'ah. We're talking about what is traditionally translated leprosy. Okay, some sort of a skin condition by which a person was excluded from the community. And yet if that skin condition ever cleared up, that person could be restored to the community. And there was a special ritual associated with that person's re-entry into society. Chapter 14. And we're looking at verses 19 through 31, but won't look at all of them. But we do see this. The priest, chapter 14, 19, the priest must sacrifice the sin offering, the chatat, and make atonement for the one to be purified from his uncleanness. A sin offering, atonement. And following all of this, the diseased individual is now declared a member in good standing of the community again. Okay? So you have then this restoration following a woman's childbirth, a man's or a person's, a citizen's leprosy event. Chapter 15, one of these that is, we're not exactly sure what's going on. It's called bodily discharge, and we think this would be probably something related to sexually transmissible disease, probably gonorrhea. Gonorrhea is often associated with, well, I won't get into the details. Let's just say with something that fits well with chapter 15 of the book of Leviticus. Okay, and when a male has this problem, okay, then in verse 15 of chapter 15, the priest is to sacrifice them, animals, expensive animals. One is a sin offering and the other is a burnt offering. In this way, the priest will make atonement for him before the Lord because of his discharge. Okay? And this would be a disease-associated discharge of some sort. Okay? Re-entry into the community requiring death for atonement, for kafar. Okay? A Nazirite touching a dead body, Numbers chapter 6. If that Nazirite has defiled himself, made a promise to be set apart for service to God, he's a non-Levite, but he wants to serve God in some ministry role, he can take the Nazirite vow. Women could do the same thing. But if they mess up and they break one of the rules associated with this vow, then they've got to start completely over, and they've got to atone for what they have done by messing up this vow. And so the restoration associated with this required sacrifice and its attendant atonement. You also have the necessity of inanimate objects being atoned for. You have a house, we're backing up to Leviticus chapter 14, verse 53. You have a house that has a bunch of mildew that breaks out in it. And every house in northeast Missouri would be leveled by now if we followed Torah law. But you have a house that's got a mildew problem, and now you've cleansed it. It's okay. You didn't have to destroy the house. But you still have to, Leviticus 14:53. Still have to atone for it. The priest is to release a live bird into the open. There are some other things associated with this. Outside the city, in this way he will make atonement for the house, and it will be clean. It's now restored for service. Okay? It's a restoration kind of sacrifice in that sense. The land, if there was a murder committed somewhere and nobody knew who committed the murder, they couldn't track down any killer in this. It happened out in the open country. There were no witnesses. There's just a corpse. Got to deal with it. To cleanse the land, there would be an atonement process that would be taken care of. So you have purification of or restoration for the proper functioning of individuals in society. They could be restored to their rightful place in society. You have a house that could be restored for use. You have the land needing to be restored in this sense as well. Clearly, yet another dimension to the concept of atonement is restoration. That which has now been rendered useless can now be made usable. And it happens through atonement. That same verb, kafar. Okay? So what have we got here? We've got the concept of covering, wiping out, ransoming. We have purification, restoration, all of these things. Ransom, if we didn't mention, I think we did mention ransom. But anyway, all these things are associated with kafar. It's a complex, very rich term. All right? And there's also a calendrical use of this term. Not only do you need to kind of keep things right and usable and to restore them, people, but also the calendar. There's one very special day out of the year that takes care of the whole rest of the year. One day out of the year that is the most atonement-filled day of the year. That day is called, in fact, Yom HaKippurim in the Hebrew. There's that KPR, Kippurim. We call it Yom Kippur in some traditions in America today. Yom Kippur, whatever. But in the Hebrew, it's Yom HaKippurim, the Day of the Atonements, plural. It's the most sacred day of the year, based upon the amount of effort that's used to describe it in the law of Moses. It happens in the 7th month, the holiest month. Happens on the 10th day. It is the most sacred day in the most sacred month. It involves rituals involving the holiest man in all of their society, the high priest. It involves him carrying out rituals that are a rank, an order above any other ritual. So it's the holiest rituals carried out in the holiest month, on the holiest day, by the holiest man in the holiest site, the tabernacle, or later on in the temple. And so you have an extremely important day here. It's a day filled with blood. There's a lot of killings of sacrificial animals on this particular day. And there are rituals that involve the cleansing, the kafaring of the priest, of the tabernacle itself. And when all of these things are properly performed, then for the next 12 to 13 to 14 cycles of the moon, depending how long that particular year is, and they have years that would be anywhere from 12 to 14 cycles of the moon long. But for the next year, that priest and that tabernacle or temple area will now be usable as a place where kafaring can take place, where God and man can be reconciled with one another, okay? Where proper rituals can be carried out, but only if that one day is done right. You don't do that day right, then none of the other days work for the tabernacle or for the temple. Very important day, the Day of Atonement. A day, again, with the slaughtering of quite a few animals, and scholars, as they've tried to figure out exactly what's going on, have suggested that even though you have daily rituals associated with atonement, there is still kind of a residue, we're guessing, okay, it's just an analogy, a metaphor. It's almost as though there's a little bit of leftover magnetic iron filings or something that are left in the temple. And so one day out of the year, you kind of get this super magnet and you just grab all up the leftover uncleanness and you just pull it all out and you completely cleanse the temple so that it's now been made usable, made right for the next year. Okay, the Day of Atonement. The first 15 chapters of the book of Leviticus kind of talk about the sacrifices and other things you've got to do to get right. The final chapters, 17 through 27 of Leviticus, talk about how to stay right. But at the apex of the book of Leviticus, the most important chapter arguably within the book is in fact Leviticus 16, which describes the rituals for the holiest day in the holiest month performed by the holiest man on the holiest site within all of Israelite culture, the Day of Atonement. Okay, so there's this calendrical cleansing as well. There is also atonement associated with the festival of the Passover, Numbers 28, Festival of Weeks, Numbers 28 also, Festival of Trumpets in the 7th month, Numbers 29. But clearly the climactic day of the year, the calendrical cleansing day, 7th month, 10th day, Day of Atonement. Okay. Now, very quickly, because we want to have some break time, well, for now, but when they start wanting their coffee, we won't be all right. Atonement in the Torah narratives. There are 4 incidents in the Old Testament law, in the Torah, that mention atonement in a slightly different way within the narratives. First of these is Exodus chapter 32. Moses has been receiving the sacred law of God on Mount Sinai. Been a cool time for Moses up in the mountains. But not for the Israelites. They were having a hot time down in the old town tonight with idols and dancing and who knows what all was going on down there. And God is mad. And Moses gets mad too. And so in Exodus chapter 32, in verse 30 in particular, we see the following statement where it says, Exodus 32:30, "The following day Moses said to the people, 'You have committed a great sin. Now I will go up to Yahweh, or to the Lord. Perhaps I will be able to pay for,'" HCSB's lame attempt, "to pay for your sin." There's a footnote, atone for your sin. Okay, maybe I can atone for your sin. Now, he didn't take any animals with him up there on the mountain. He didn't take any incense to burn up on the mountain. How's he going to atone for the sin? How's he going to pay for the sin? Well, he'll have a long conversation with God. That's what it amounts to. And they'll kind of duke it out up there on the mountain in prayer. And by the time it's all said and done, God doesn't destroy the Israelite people. Okay? And life goes on. God has apparently been kafared somehow. Moses hoped he could, and apparently he succeeded in all of that. What was he doing up there? What was he attempting to do? Apparently take away the anger of God, to expiate God in that sense, to propitiate, all these big 8 terms. Whatever he was doing, he was trying to restore a broken relationship, okay, between God and God's people, the covenant people. All right. A second narrative was the one mentioned earlier, the Korah narrative, Numbers chapter 16. And again, as we noted earlier, atonement was necessary following Korah's rebellion. There had been death. By the way, there was death of many sinners following the golden calf incident. There was death in the Baal Peor, in the Korah's rebellion, and in Numbers 25 in the Baal of Peor incident. Numbers chapter 25, verse 13. We do see following statement, 25:13. God saying, and now he's talking about, well, he's really kind of like pinning a medal on a priest here. Phinehas, son of Eleazar, who killed a sinful man and a sinful woman in the midst of the bad things that were going on. And he turned back the wrath of the Lord through his shedding of blood in all of that. And so in verses 11 through 13, God is now praising Phinehas, the priest, for what he has done in committing these acts that assuaged God's anger and after 24,000 people had died. And God says in verse 13, "It'll be a covenant of perpetual priesthood for him and his descendants because he was zealous for his God and made atonement for the Israelites." Made atonement through the killing of a man and a woman who were in an act of sin in this particular chapter. Okay? But nonetheless, Phinehas is praised and rewarded. In fact, his family line is given a great promise that will be fulfilled in the days of Zadok, or Tzadok, in the days of Solomon, many, many years after this point in time. But a covenant of perpetual priesthood is established with Phinehas and his descendants because he was zealous for God and made atonement for the Israelites through what he did. That somehow, again, satisfied God so that God's anger cooled down and God's relationship with his community was reestablished. He kafared for them, did Phinehas. And then finally, chapter 31, verse 50, again, one of these other outliers, one of these other things that doesn't exactly fit with many of these other stories, but chapter 31, verse 50, the Israelites have gone to war against the Midianites. Midianites were being mean, and God said, exact vengeance for the Israelites against the Midianites, chapter 31, verse 2, and boy, they did. The Israelites zapped them good, so that by the time we get to verse 50, close to the end of the chapter, the men who have survived this battle against a superior force, the Israelites were not as well armed as the Midianites. They should not have done as well as they did in battle, but the men are very grateful that they did. And so they're wanting to say thank you to God. And so verse 50, we have presented to the Lord an offering, the leaders of the Israelite soldiers say, we've presented to the Lord an offering of the gold articles each man found, armlets, bracelets, rings, earrings, and necklaces. By the way, that was typically pay for your military service. You could strip the corpses of the people you killed, and whatever you could take off the dead people's bodies, that was your pay, and that's what these guys had. We've taken these things, and now we're going to give some of them to God to make atonement for ourselves before the Lord. Okay, we're going to give God these pieces of gold to say thank you, or to kafar God. Now, if this can be connected to the others, this might be this concept of restoration associated with a plague. They had to count their men, a military census following this battle, and when they counted their men, they said, whoa, nobody died. Can you believe that? Nobody died, and we all fought a terrible war. But we did count the people, and so we took a military census, and God said He'd make a plague break out if we didn't give Him a kofar, an atonement, something or other, a ransom or whatever. And so we're going to give Him a portion of the booty. We're going to give Him some of the gold we took off the dead folks out there. So maybe this is this concept of the ransom following a census right here. Atonement, it's a big concept in the Hebrew. Best we understand, it was not a part of the Canaanite culture. Certainly wasn't a part of anything known in Babylonian culture. There's not a true analogy. But it seems to be related to restoration of a relationship. It's regularly connected with death, with the shedding of blood. Could be human blood, in the case of God's judgment against some plagues that broke out. It could be a substitutionary death. But nonetheless, because of atonement, we do have a right standing with God. The Israelites, amen. The Israelites got it in an anticipatory way through the shedding of animals' blood, but we have it in the fullest sense, don't we? With the death of Christ, who was in fact our Lamb who died in our behalf. Any questions that you all might have as we wrap this up? I guess we're done. Okay, thank you.